This episode is brought to you by Gempler's Farm and Home Store, family-owned and based right here in Wisconsin. Shop Gemplers.com for winter workwear from Carhartt, Patagonia, and more. Clothing and footwear orders of $50 or more ship free with free returns every day. Visit the deals page at Gemplers.com for more offers. Welcome to the Moses Organic Farming Podcast. This is Chuck from Moses. Quick announcement. If you know one thing about Moses, it's probably that we host the largest organic farming conference in the United States. This year, instead of having our event in La Crosse, we're co-hosting a virtual conference called Growing Stronger. This collaborative conference on organic and sustainable farming will be held from February 22nd to the 27th, 2021. We are partnering with several other events, including the Grassworks Conference, O-Grain Conference, Midwest Organic Pork Conference, and the Organic Vegetable Production Conference to create this 5-in-1 virtual event. While we'll miss seeing everyone in person, we're really excited about this and hope to see you there. Registration starts December 1st at mosesorganic.org/conference. Now, on to the show. Have you ever heard the term insect apocalypse? Sounds like the plot of a B movie from the 50s where an army of 100-foot-tall grasshoppers rise up to defeat humanity. But it's actually the other way around. Because of human impact on the environment, an estimated 41% of invertebrate species face extinction. How farms are managed is one really important aspect of that decline, and this presentation by Karin Jokela goes over some practical steps at promoting pollinator habitat on your farm. Karin is a biologist at the Xerces Society, who works to protect invertebrates and their habitat. Xerces is nationwide, and Karin works in Minnesota and Wisconsin as an NRCS partner biologist. She is also an organic vegetable farmer. Karin gives us a sense of what pollinator conservation is, puts the organic standards into the context of pollinator conservation and what that looks like on organic farms, and then goes over some of the NRCS programs that offer both financial and technical assistance. This is the first in a series of 3 episodes on pollinator habitat, so stay tuned in the coming weeks. This was recorded at a field day in August 2019 at Blue Fruit Farm near Winona, Minnesota. Karin mentions some of the images in her slides in the audio, and I've linked to some of them here, but she also does a really good job of describing the pictures she's showing, so don't worry too much about that. Let's get to it.
So I have to start here because when we talk about biodiversity conservation, especially in terms of wildlife, a lot of us conjure up pictures of pandas or even other game species, but really the vast majority of the diversity in the animal kingdom is arthropods. 75% of those are insects, about 80% arthropods. A lot of them soil dwelling. And these insects are completely, we are totally intertwined with them. We are dependent on them. They are recycling nutrients through the system, terrestrially and aquatically. They're offering us free pest control services. They are doing the very important service of turning plants into food for other animals. So I have a bluebird pictured here, but I like to give the example of a chickadee. Research shows that one pair of chickadees needs anywhere from 6,000 to 10,000 individual caterpillars to rear a nest of babies. Over about 3 weeks, that's about 450 caterpillars a day that they need. And those are caterpillars that are feeding on our native plants. And so the birds need these native plants in the community as well. And then, of course, the main focus of this part of the section or part of the presentation is that insects help plants reproduce. So we'll talk a little bit about those types of insects called pollinators. They are valuable to our economy as well. I kind of have to talk in the economic realm as well, not just the ecological realm. This is 35% of our crop production is dependent on pollinators. That has real economic value in the global economy, but also for farmers, right? Farmers' yield is dependent on pollinators. And these are some of the most interesting foods that we eat, most nutritious foods, coffees, oils, fruits, vegetables. This is where all of our nutrient diversity is coming from. When we talk about pollinators, we think of this kind of broad category of pollinators that include butterflies, flies, moths, wasps, beetles, and bees. However, bees are objectively the most important pollinator, and this is where I usually ask the crowd why. Anybody can jump in, or I might just start rolling through. Any thoughts? Maybe from this corner.
Is it because they stay in the same species?
Yeah, that's an important one. Yeah, what we call like fidelity or floral constancy. So I'll just kind of go through here. They're actively collecting pollen from one species at a time. So in the spring, for example, they're going to go from an apple tree to an apple tree to an apple tree, instead of going from an apple tree to a dandelion blossom to a willow. And so from a plant's perspective, that's really important because if you're an apple tree, you have no use for dandelion pollen. So you want them to be consistent in that way. There are also, all these pollinators that I showed you, the bee is the only one that needs pollen for its entire life cycle, pollen and nectar. So it's eating pollen and nectar as an adult. It's also eating pollen and nectar as an egg, a larva, and so forth. Versus some of these other floral visitors, the wasps, the beetles, they're eating pollen and nectar as an adult, but their young are not dependent on pollen and nectar. They're eating our pest insects. They're eating other things in the environment. So bees are the most important for a diversified crop grower who needs these animals to increase yield. And there's an amazing diversity of native bees that we're still learning about. In Minnesota, we're still counting, but we know that there are at least 450 different species. In the United States, there's 3,600 species, over 5,000 on the continent, and at least 20,000 worldwide. And so when I put this in the context of kind of the organic standards and that mandate for biodiversity conservation, I think it's worthwhile to point out the differences between honeybees and native bees, especially for resource professionals who are working with producers who maybe have honeybees. Honeybees are not at risk of extinction. That's probably the first thing to highlight. So honeybee conservation is not wildlife conservation. We consider them a livestock species. They are managed by humans. We provide their nests for them. And they're social. They have these large colonies, and often they prefer non-native flowers. So they can do a lot of pollination services. There's no doubt about that. We move them all over the country for pollination services. But beekeeping is not wildlife conservation, and introducing honeybees to achieve the biodiversity mandate in your organic operation is not really doing what it's intended to do. So instead, we want to be creating habitat for native bees, of which there are many in the Midwest, and many are at risk of extinction. And organic farms can be a really great home for them. They're not managed by humans. They create their own nests. Most of them are solitary. 99% of them are solitary. And they are dependent on these native wildflowers. So not only when we create pollinator habitat, we're also creating habitat for this vast diversity of other beneficial insects out there. Less than about 1% of insects out there are actually pest insects. The rest are all either beneficial or neutral. We know that if more than 20% of a farm is in diverse habitat, we will see pest control services throughout the farm. So especially in the world of USDA programs, we often have programs called pollinator enhancements. And if a farmer's resource concern is pest control services, that pollinator habitat can really achieve the same results. But it's a little hard for a land manager to wrap your head around all that diversity, right? So I like to think of it in terms of what are their nesting habitats. It's a little easier to figure out how to manage your farm, your habitat, your kind of practices to benefit these different groups. So 70% of our native bees are ground nesting bees, solitary ground nesting bees. About 30% of them are stem nesting, cavity nesting, They might use old beetle bore holes in wood, decaying wood. But basically we consider them stem or cavity nesting bees. And then about 1% of those are bumblebees. Those are our one true social native bee. And they will nest all over the place. We can talk about that. And I just like to throw this slide up there because when we think about ground nesting bees, I sometimes do a little poll and say, who's seen a ground nesting bee? And often people will shoot up their hands and say, yeah, I've run into them. And what they really have run into are paper wasps, or not paper wasps, but yellow jackets. Basically, wasps have given all ground nesting bees kind of a bad rap because a lot of people encounter ground nesting wasps, which are territorial, they are very defensive, versus our solitary ground nesting bees are really not defensive in that way at all. Unless you are walking around on a very sandy slope or something, you're not very likely to run into them. But this is kind of a visual depiction of what some of these nesting opportunities can look like on farms. They can be in these sort of sandy, open areas that are untilled. They can be in nests, the kind of pithy stem of a native plant. Most of them are not excavating out. There are a couple of sections that will actually excavate out the center of a stem, but most of them are using something that's already naturally hollow. So they're anywhere from a couple inches down to a couple feet down. I would say on average about a foot down. They will collect nectar and pollen, form it into this kind of bee bread, like a little ball, lay an egg on it, seal it up, and then never go back to that little room. And then the mother, this is all female, is a single mother doing this nest building. And she flies away at the end of the season, and those eggs are developing as larvae and pupae the rest of the season. So when we think about pollinator habitat, we think about flowers, right? They need flowers, but they also need year-round nest protection as well, because the rest of their life cycle is going on not when they're flying. Okay, so just to simplify, the main requirements of all pollinators and beneficial insects is diverse vegetation and season-long nectar and pollen. The vegetation part I get at because of the host plant aspect and that all these other insects out there need different kinds of vegetation. Shelter for nesting and overwintering, so some undisturbed areas that they can have protection from disturbance. And then, of course, refuge from pesticides. And obviously, they need refuge from insecticides, but there's a lot of evidence that they need refuge from herbicides and fungicides as well. So this is kind of the basics of my job, how to assess habitat and design improvements. The first place I'd like to start is to recognize existing habitat on the farm. So this is some of that stuff that's less obvious. If it's not a pollinator meadow, there might still be really important habitat on the farm. And I then identify what's deficient and try to target new enhancements to meet those deficiencies. So it's a little strategic. We're not just opportunistically throwing wildflower seed out and thinking that we're doing the best thing for pollinators. So this is an image that I took from one of our brochures that I have in the back there called Farming for Pollinators. And I like to keep this just like on my desk because I'm a really visual person and I like to imagine all the different ways that pollinator habitat can be manifested on a farm. Now, this is a really idealized farm, and that might occur here down in Wisconsin, but in most places, you don't get all these different habitat features, such as riparian areas, some wet areas, some kind of marginal non-crop land, some big like cover crop that has flowers potentially, even small garden plots. Small garden plots can provide good habitat. Understory planting, so either that's the understory of an orchard or in a woodland setting, that can provide really important stuff too. So I'll walk through some of these and how they might kind of interact with NRCS programs. But first I want to introduce you to this assessment tool. This is something that I regularly use in the field. We call it the Pollinator Habitat Assessment Form and Guide, or for short, a HAG, Habitat Assessment Guide. We have one for pollinator habitat, we have one for beneficial insect habitat, and we also have one for natural areas. So this is all available online for free as a downloadable PDF, as well as all of our other materials, really. all for free for distribution to help you improve habitat and restoration. So basically what it does is go through these kind of different levels of assessment. First, it starts with the landscape feature. So this is really important because even if Jim never put any habitat on his farm, his landscape context is such that the surrounding environment is bringing a lot of diversity into his farm. So the individual farmer may not have a lot of influence on making changes here, but it does impact what we would expect to see on a farm. So if they're surrounded by cornfields for miles and miles and miles, no matter how amazing we create habitat on this individual farm, that landscape context is going to influence what eventually shows up, right? So that matters. And the idea is here to kind of create a numerical, a quantifiable before score, and then implement some improvements and find out kind of how you're improving quantitatively. So then we go to the farmscape features, like if you've got pasture, forest, and so forth. Foraging habitat, it breaks it down into like spring, summer, and fall blooms to identify where the gaps are. So if we need to design a seed mix that's really heavy on spring bloom because that's your gap, that teases that out there. We also have a section on native bee nesting habitat and also on different farm management practices. So like what pesticides you're using, how much you're grazing, if you're burning a lot, all of these things influence kind of the pollinator community. So this is just one tool that I use a lot. And then another tool that I like to use if you're an NRCS planner or working within federal programs is this TechNote 2014 Farm Bill Programs for Pollinator Conservation. And it is 2014, but our staff are working on a 2018 update, which is really not going to change very much except for the title. The program, eligibility requirements, everything within the document really is up to date. But what it does is go through all the different NRCS programs, EQIP, CSP, CRP, and so forth, and explains who's eligible and what the financial assistance is and how can they accomplish different types of habitat improvements. And now I just want to talk about some of those habitat improvements that we can make on farms. So like I said, I'm going to talk about it in terms of sort of NRCS language, but know that it doesn't, these are just types that you can implement even without being part of a Farm Bill program. So I'll first discuss those larger footprint plantings that are primarily you're throwing down seed. Often they're in the EQIP program or CRP or CSP. We'll talk about cover crops, tree and shrub plantings and bare value. And then sometimes maybe you don't need to start from scratch. Maybe you just need to manage a habitat by clearing out some shrubs, and then you'll have this amazing diversity of remnant below. The first is probably the most frequently used type of pollinator habitat planting through Farm Bill programs, which is called conservation cover. And the primary objective is to put in permanent vegetation. There are lots of different scenarios within this program where you can just have it be primarily grasses, you can have it be non-native, but there is one scenario which requires 75% of the mix being forbs based on seeds per square foot. So this is high density wildflowers. A lot of people will use this right adjacent to their crops. This is a blueberry field in Michigan where they're using this obviously to attract pollinators, but then also to attract native beneficial insects. I like to just show imagery of what this can look like once it's established. I like this image. This is on a cranberry bog in New Hampshire, and I like this image because it's showing an abundance of at least 3 different species blooming in the spring, which is usually, even in these high-density wildflower plantings, the spring bloom is very, very low. And this is showing pretty even distribution of spring blooming species. There's a high rate of those species in the seed mix, and it's just abundant flowers. So that's, and it's really attractive. So a lot of these organic farms are also U-pick operations, or at least bringing people onto their farms. And so not only is this providing functional ecological value, it's also providing a lot of aesthetic value. This is another way to use conservation cover. Some states are just beginning to develop scenarios called Beetle Banks. And this is a picture from Grinnell Heritage Farm in Iowa, where we worked with them specifically on this. This is called a beetle bank, and it's just native grasses. And the idea is to create this permanent refuge for beetles that are primarily eating pests, insects, but also weed seeds. But they don't travel very far. So the idea is to integrate this within the fields. So they're providing those pest management services right next to the crops. This is another one that it's not even adopted. This is a new practice that has not been adopted in any state yet, but it might be adopted in some states in fiscal year 2020. And the idea is to pull out those acres that are specifically wildlife focused versus conservation cover, which is just kind of the permanent vegetation. This is to pull out wildlife specific acres. And I really like the potential here because there are two different scenarios that it might apply. One where you want to improve wildlife habitat for specific target species like monarchs. But this is the one that really excites me, which I haven't seen any language yet developing this. But to establish wildlife habitat that resembles a historic native plant community. And this feels radical for NRCS, but I'm really excited because in Minnesota we have this native plant community guide, which could really just feed right into this kind of program because we have a sense of what our native plant communities used to be, and we could try to rebuild them. So I don't want to make any promises here. We're not even sure that Minnesota will adopt this practice until 2021, but this is on the horizon. Another common one to be using on organic farms is field border. This is a picture from a farm out in Montana that we've worked with a lot, and they have put in these large strips of wildflower plantings in between their crop fields, and they use it for pest control, they use it for moisture management, they use it for all kinds of purposes. But if you're going to use a field border on an organic farm and it's adjacent to a conventional farm, we suggest not putting in wildflowers or really anything that's flowering, because that could become a sink then if it's contaminated with any kinds of pesticides. So field borders that are adjacent to conventional land should be pure grass stands or conifers, or that's kind of the best management practices these days. It used to be that organic farmers would say, hey, I'm required to put in this buffer. Why not put the pollinator habitat in that buffer? Well, we know that that's really not a safe place for pollinators these days. We recommend flowering borders only if it's surrounded by other organically managed or natural areas. Field border, this scenario can take a lot of different forms. You could also just use pollinator-friendly vegetation, meaning non-native clovers in between, basically as turnaround areas. If you're using a field border for pesticide drift protection, we recommend that it's basically non-flowering. And I like to recommend tall native grasses, even though it's not required to be native, because they can get 8 feet tall and because of their really deep root system. And we know a lot of these pesticides are water soluble and can travel through the soil. And so they help really kind of buffer that drift above and below ground. And I know in some parts of the state, in Minnesota in particular, in western Minnesota, Bowser, for example, does not recommend conifer drift protection because then it fragments the prairie part of the state. So they don't like to put in these tree hedgerows because they're already losing prairie habitat. And the more we fragment it with tree lines, the more we're kind of losing some of that important prairie connectivity. So sometimes field border is appropriate there. Cover crops are a great way to create like short-term forage for pollinators. We like to recommend any like buckwheats, phacelia, partridge peas, sunflowers. Some of these may not meet your state standard, so if you are planning habitat, make sure to refer to your state standard before contracting anything. But the flowering habitat can really attract not just pollinators, but all of these other really neat native insects. Tree and shrub planting is another potential way to create habitat for early season blooms. Like you were saying, some of your fruit trees fill that niche, that early season bloom time. You might also choose to put in native shrubs for stem nesting bees, like you can see that down there. These are just some of the species that we know to be very good for nesting. Some of these are not going to be on state lists to meet kind of financial assistance programs. For example, box elder is never going to be on a cost share list. But it's one of those things as a planner for you to have some intuitive sense so that when you're on the farm assessing the existing habitat, that might not be seen as a nuisance and might be actually providing value to the farmer. So this tree and shrub planting practice can be applied in a lot of different ways. It could also be used as a kind of drift protection form. So these kind of conifers, this is an organic blueberry farm in Northfield. They've got this conifer strip. There's a conventional farm behind them. They've got their beneficial insects habitat on the inside, and then off to the right, where you can't see, that's their blueberry farm. So they've got kind of this tiered approach for pesticide protection, but also beneficial habitat. Or you could kind of use a tree and shrub planting in a place where it's really, on an organic farm, it's really too hard to get things established from seed. So this is a basin that's full of reed canary grass. It's going to take many, many dedicated years to clean that up, to prep it for a seed prep for like a wildflower planting. So instead, they're putting in native shrubs, which are more mature and eventually will be able to kind of outcompete in those strips the reed canary grass. But then sometimes planting isn't always the best thing to do. Sometimes you can do a lot better by just managing the landscape that you already have on the farm. So this is a photo from a farm that I worked with in Trumpealo County this spring. And they had worked with Fish and Wildlife to remove some cedars off of their bluff prairie. And underneath it came this amazing prairie with all these conservative plant species that you never find in seed mixes because they're just expensive seeds, they're hard to establish. And what I can see in this photo is a whole bunch of wood betony and shooting star. Both are bumblebee beloved species by queen bumblebees in the spring. They're about 75% pollinated. It's a little hard to see in this picture. And this is a fruit farm. So down below is all the apple orchards. So they're creating this really early season bloom prior to the apple blooming. They're just creating this like really resilient environment for bumblebees. So there are a lot of different NRCS practices that can help a farmer just manage and improve the existing habitat without putting in like a pollinator meadow. Which can also just do really good things and I think are underutilized. And we don't think of them as pollinator habitat practices, but they really can be used that way. And then finally, if you just don't know where to begin, some of you are TSPs, there is a program through EQIP, the Pollinator Conservation Activity Plan, where you would hire a TSP to come out and work with the farmer and write a comprehensive plan for where to start on pollinator habitat development on the farm. And that can then be handed off to the NRCS office as sort of a guide for how to move forward with the contracting process in 5-10 years down the road. And finally, I should probably be putting this at the beginning of all these slides because when we put in habitat, we want to do it in a strategic way. These federal dollars are meant to create this habitat for pollinators, and we want to be putting it in a place that's actually going to achieve that intended effect. So we want to put in habitat that it has the least risk of pesticide drift. You want it to, if there is risk of drift, then you want it to be non-flowering. There are each state program is going to have different recommendations. This is constantly a shifting thing. Bowser, the state of Minnesota Bowser program requirements require 200-foot buffer from anything that has a neonic treated seed. Based on our literature review with our pesticide program, these are the standards that we've come up with, but more buffer is better, I think, because as Jim was saying, we have this contamination even just in the rain. But these can be challenging with different program standards within NRCS. So just use some of your intuition as well when you're planning these. One thing I think is really overlooked is considering the pesticide carryover in soil. So it used to be common practice, it really still is common practice, to seed a pollinator planting right after doing conventional soy. They say, you've got a clean seed bed because it's been sprayed for all the weeds for a year, and you got a crop out of it. But a lot of even the herbicides that are used on conventional cropland can have 24-month carryover, which can stunt your native seedlings, if they even germinate at all. Not only that, but some of the insecticides that are being carried over, the systemic insecticides, can last in the soil for up to 2 years as well, and those would be taken up by our native plants, expressed in all the vascular tissue, and basically be toxic to anything that's eating the plant, but also the pollinators that are visiting and eating the pollen and nectar.
Thanks to Karin Jokela from the Xerces Society. Check out the Xerces Society at xerces.org. That's xerces.org. And thank you for listening to the Moses Organic Farming Podcast. Moses educates farmers in sustainable and organic agriculture. Call the Organic Answer Line to ask a specialist about organic farming and certification at 888-90-MOSES or visit mosesorganic.org/ask. Thanks again to our patron sponsor, Gemplers. Visit gemplers.com. If you have questions about today's episode or have ideas for future episodes, please contact me at chuck@mosesorganic.org. Our theme song is Summerfields by the Tenements. If you have a minute, please rate and review our show in your podcast app. It helps people find the show. Thanks again for listening.